The rain had been falling for 3 days, straight when Sarah finally agreed to meet him. She sat in the corner booth of the small café, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the door with the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying too many scars. When Marcus walked in, shaking water from his jacket, she noticed immediately how his eyes scanned the room with practiced caution, the way a man looks when he's spent years protecting something precious. Their mutual friend had insisted they were perfect for each other, both single, both lonely, both deserving of a second chance. But Sarah knew better than anyone that deserving and receiving were two entirely different things. She raised her hand slightly, just enough to catch his attention, and watched as recognition softened his features. He was handsome in an understated way, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though something about the set of his shoulders told her he carried weight too. As he approached, Sarah felt her rehearsed greeting dissolve on her tongue, replaced by the question that had been haunting her for months, maybe years. "Do you think I still deserve happiness?" The words tumbled out before he'd even sat down, raw and unfiltered, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Marcus froze, one hand on the back of the chair, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. She'd spent too long hiding, too long pretending, too long believing that her past had already written her future. If this was going to be another disappointment, another reminder that some people were simply meant to watch happiness from a distance, she wanted to know now. He sat down slowly, carefully, as if approaching something fragile. "That's a hell of a first question," he said, his voice gentle but not pitying, which somehow made it worse. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, shame mixing with defiance. She'd done it again. Let the darkness spill out before showing any light. Let the wound show before the person. But Marcus didn't reach for his phone with some excuse about needing to leave. Instead, he leaned forward, his forearms on the table, and said, "Tell me why you're asking." So she did. The words came in a flood, 3 years of silence breaking like a dam. She told him about Jake, about the relationship that had started with flowers and ended with fear. She told him about the bruises she'd learned to hide, the apologies she'd learned to accept, the person she'd slowly become, smaller, quieter, convinced that love was supposed to hurt, if you weren't good enough to deserve the gentle kind. She told him about the night she'd finally left, running with nothing but her car keys and the clothes on her back, and about the months that followed in her sister's spare room, crying into pillows at 2 a.m, wondering if the broken feeling would ever fade. "Everyone says it gets better," Sarah continued, her fingers tearing tiny pieces from her napkin. "They say you heal, you move on, you find yourself again, but I don't think I ever knew who I was to begin with. And now I'm 32 years old, working as a receptionist, living alone in a studio apartment, and I look at other people, people at the grocery store, people walking their dogs, people having normal, uncomplicated lives, and I wonder what's wrong with me. Why couldn't I see what he was? Why did I stay so long? And if I was that wrong about everything, how can I trust myself to recognize happiness even if it showed up?" She finally looked up, expecting to see the familiar expressions she'd seen on every face since she'd started being honest about her past. Pity, discomfort, or worse, the kind of interest that came from people who saw damage as an invitation. But Marcus's face showed none of these things. Instead, he looked thoughtful, sad even, but not for her, with her. "Can I tell you about my daughter?" he asked. Sarah blinked, thrown by the shift, but nodded. "Emma's 9. She likes dinosaurs, hates mushrooms, and has this way of asking questions that make me realize I don't know anything about anything." A small smile crossed his face, the kind that comes automatically when parents talk about their kids. "Her mom, my ex-wife, left when Emma was 2. Just decided one day that motherhood wasn't what she signed up for. Packed her bags while Emma was at daycare and left a note on the kitchen counter." Sarah's chest tightened. "I'm sorry." Marcus shook his head. "I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because for a long time I asked myself the same question you just asked. Not about whether I deserved happiness. I'd kind of given up on that for myself. But about Emma. I'd lie awake at night wondering if she deserved a father who was failing at everything. I was working 2 jobs, barely keeping the bills paid, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee. I was so tired I once put orange juice in her cereal. She was so sweet about it too. Ate 3 spoonfuls before gently informing me that breakfast tasted funny. Despite everything, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up. Marcus's smile widened. The thing is, I spent 2 years convinced I was screwing everything up. That she deserved better, a real family, a mother who wanted her, a father who had his life together. And then one night, Emma was having a nightmare. I rushed into her room and she was crying, tangled up in her sheets. I held her, and when she finally calmed down, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, I'm glad you're here. You always come when I'm scared." He paused, his eyes distant with the memory. That's when I realized I'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't about deserving. It was about showing up, about trying, about being present for the moments that matter, even when everything else is falling apart. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the wall she'd built. "But how do you know?" she asked quietly. "How do you know when to trust again? When to believe that something good isn't just another trap?" Marcus considered this carefully. "I don't think you ever know for sure, but I also don't think that's the point. You can't let one person who couldn't see your worth convince you that you don't have any. That's giving them power they shouldn't have, long after they're gone." The cafe around them had grown busier, the lunch crowd filtering in, but Sarah barely noticed. She was caught in the strange sensation of being truly seen, truly heard, by someone who wasn't trying to fix her or save her or tell her everything would be okay. Marcus was just sitting with her, in the uncomfortable truth that healing wasn't linear and happiness wasn't guaranteed, but that didn't mean it wasn't possible. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said. "If a friend came to you, someone you cared about, and they asked you that same question, do you think they deserve happiness? What would you tell them?" Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it. The answer was obvious when it wasn't about herself. Of course they would. Everyone deserves happiness. "Everyone," Marcus repeated gently, "including you." "But I made choices." "You survived," he interrupted, not unkindly. "You made choices in an impossible situation with someone who was manipulating you. That's not the same as failing. That's not the same as being unworthy." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked rapidly, trying to keep them at bay. She'd cried enough. She was tired of crying. But these tears felt different, less like grief and more like release. "This is a terrible first date," she managed with a watery laugh. Marcus smiled, a real one this time that reached his eyes. "Or maybe it's the most honest one either of us has ever had." He signaled the waitress. "How about we start over? Order some actual food. Talk about literally anything else for a while. You can tell me about your job, your family, what you like to do on weekends, all the normal first date stuff." "Why would you want to?" Sarah asked, genuinely confused. "I just unloaded 3 years of trauma on you in 15 minutes. "Because you asked a brave question," Marcus said simply. "And because I think maybe we both need to remember that our worst moments don't define our worth. Also, because anyone who has the courage to ask that question out loud is someone I want to know better." They talked for 3 hours. Sarah learned that Marcus coached Emma's soccer team, despite knowing nothing about soccer, that he'd taught himself to braid hair through YouTube videos, and that his daughter's current ambition was to be a paleontologist, who also knew karate. He learned that Sarah volunteered at an animal shelter on weekends, that she'd always wanted to take a pottery class but was terrified of being bad at it, and that she made the world's best chocolate chip cookies, according to her nephew, who was admittedly biased. They didn't talk about love or relationships or the future. They just talked and laughed. And somewhere in the space between the stories, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Light. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it. The sense that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over. that the chapters written in pain didn't have to dictate the ones still blank. When they finally left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The sidewalks were slick and shining, reflecting the afternoon sun that had broken through the clouds. Marcus walked her to her car, hands in his pockets, a comfortable silence between them. "I'd like to see you again," he said, "if you want to. No pressure. We can take it as slow as you need." Sarah looked at him. This kind man who'd met her darkness with honesty instead of platitudes, who'd shared his own struggles instead of presenting a perfect facade. She thought about the question she'd asked, the one that had felt so urgent just hours before. She still didn't know the answer, not completely. But maybe that was okay. Maybe deserving happiness wasn't about being perfect or healed or ready. Maybe it was about choosing to show up for your own life, even when you were scared. Especially when you were scared. "I'd like that," she said. And when she smiled, she meant it. As she drove home, Sarah thought about Emma, a little girl who knew her father would always come when she was scared. She thought about Marcus, rebuilding a life from broken pieces and teaching himself to braid hair in the early morning hours. She thought about herself, the woman who'd run with nothing, and was slowly building something from that nothing. Perhaps happiness wasn't something you deserved or didn't deserve. Perhaps it was something you chose. Day after day, moment after moment, in the face of every reason not to. Perhaps it was showing up at a cafe in the rain, asking a terrifying question, and being brave enough to stay for the answer. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was already happier than she'd realized, simply because she'd finally asked.